You know what the actor George Clooney said? He said, you can never learn much from hearing yourself speak. So hopefully I've done the learning before, and that you might learn a bit as I speak to you. Now, how do I know much about my subject? I was an outsider really in the South African Air Force, only dragged in there for my national service. I was originally sent off, or they were going to send me off to the Army Artillery. And I somehow wangled myself out of that. And then the next thing, when I was done my boot camp at the South African Air Force in the gymnasium, they then wanted to send me off to a squadron that had Skymasters, because they'd known I'd work on Skymasters as a kid. Somehow I got out of that as well. Talk about serendipity. I was then assigned to a small group, a small team, which were doing manpower studies in visits to squadrons and air depots in South Africa. And the reason was, even at this stage, politics were involved in that. And I only realised that once I came to prepare the talk. The top brass of the maintenance group, we dealt with the colonel there. They wanted evidence that South African Air Force technical manpower was insufficient for the task or the task ahead, and wanted our findings to justify procuring more aero-skilled technical people. So my information today is from what I saw in the South African Air Force, how South African Airways were involved with the South African Air Force and the police at that stage, and also from talks I've had with Defence Force people over the years in my visits back to South Africa. So the South African Air Force had to make difficult decisions with a very great lack of coordination due to rapid expansion. There was a severe shortage of skilled manpower, as I mentioned, and there were threats of, and there were actual arms embargoes which were steadily put in place over the years. So from an Air Force squadron point of view, with situations that developed, that there was nobody to service aircraft after they reached the point of their first minor inspection, brand new aeroplanes. And what they were doing at one stage there, they were actually pulling new aeroplanes out of the box and putting them together, just because the aeroplanes that were put away in the hangar weren't serviceable anymore. And then they had problems with, serious problems with stores and spares, where some of the maintenance people would be tearing their hair out, because what they would do, they would have an aeroplane that would have only one part short, and they were waiting for this part to arrive. Meanwhile, the squadron wanted to keep up its normal activities and training, and another aeroplane would go down with a fault, and then they would go to the one that was a spare in the hangar, and they would take a separate part off, put that in the plane to get it going. And so these aeroplanes were virtually like stores, some of them, where they were taking, where they were installing new parts on this thing and testing them out, and the next thing it couldn't fly because somebody had taken another part. And then because the Air Force was growing so quickly and ordering so many parts from overseas, the stores people had extreme difficulty to keep up with the whole source system. By the way, did any of you ever work or know anything about the NATO 13 number system? This was widely used in the South African Air Force as well. So in this talk, I don't think we're going to talk too much about it, but South Africa had enemies, and I'll use the term Namibia and Southwest Africa interchangeably. Everybody's got a good idea where Southwest Africa is, and just north of Southwest Africa on the west coast, of course, you have this huge territory of Angola. This was the insignia of the South African Air Force up to about 1957, and it shows the Springbok in the normal RAF roundel there. Before that, like during World War II, they had the normal, what we call the RAF or RAAF roundel. The only difference was that the centre roundel was not red, but it was orange. So all pictures that you might see, historical pictures, it's impossible to say if the aircraft was actually a South African aircraft or a Royal Air Force aircraft. I think Australia probably suffered the same kind of thing using the Royal Air Force roundel all the time. But this is what the South African Air Force ended up with until the new dispensation occurred in the 90s. And it's got this configuration of the castle. Now the castle goes right back to like the 16th century, and you will see castles throughout the world where colonial powers put up castles. So that's the castle that was in South Africa, and then of course it had the golden springbok in the middle of it. This was the original headquarters of the Atlas Aircraft Corporation, and they were situated at the international airport, used the same runways as the civilian planes did in Johannesburg, and it was founded in 1965 to produce military aircraft. The company's creation was motivated by growing international pressure on South Africa due to the government's racial policies, which were called Apartheid. It was reorganised in 1968 again, and it became part of a huge conglomerate which was called Armaments Corporation, or Arms Corp. And so many South African companies were subcontractors to this Arms Corp. There were literally thousands of factories and other businesses working with them. And it was a busy 20 years for Atlas in years 1960 to 1980, because South Africa got involved in what's called the border war. And because it was almost near impossible to import military equipment, including aircraft, Atlas was tasked to locally manufacture various ones, their avionics and associated components. It also had a division for maintenance of aircraft. And the reason for this is that presumably people who never had South African citizenship couldn't be used at the squadron level, the sharp end in other words. And they also tried to sell aircraft overseas as well. And later on it became desperate to try and get better fighter aircraft and strike aircraft, because the guys on the other side, they were both in Angola and Cubans, and they of course were supplied by the Soviets with no shortage of aircraft. These were the types of embargoes that were put again on South Africa. First of all, you had a non-binding embargo, and then eventually they became binding through the Security Council. And most countries followed this. You also had in 1970, you can see, you had anti-apartheid groups in England, for instance, directly protesting outside companies like Westland and that, to tell them to stop supplying anything to South Africa. And the shortage of skilled labour was, they thought it partially could overcome that, because the British aircraft industry under Prime Minister Wilson was in the process of being dismantled. And there were many people from Britain who wanted to come and live and work in South Africa. And for instance, I remember speaking to a man one day and he said, well, what did you do? And he said, oh, I built the rear sections of the Concorde. The question also I ask is, couldn't South Africa have got other aircraft clandestinely from other countries? But apparently these countries must have been very scared of punitive action, because that never happened. And then a principal supplier was of course the French. And start asking a question, did South Africa literally have to pay through the nose to buy this French equipment? Could the French just say, this airplane is going to cost that much, or take it or leave it? These are questions I don't know. In other words, a complete hostage client. We know that South Africa at the time was a very big gold exporter, and so possibly gold exports paid for a lot of this stuff. This aircraft is called the Kudu. Kudu is a type of antelope, by the way. And it's got a long checkered history, this aircraft, because it was first designed by Lockheed in the United States. And the original ones looked like a big Cessna 182, if I can describe it that way. And anyway, they flew it in, they had it manufactured in Mexico originally, and then Aeromacchi in Italy got very interested in it, and they produced it as well. They called it the AL60B. In the ones sent to Africa were called the AL60C. And it changed its nose wheel and everything for a tail wheel. It looks completely different. The fuselage is very boxy. And the 60 was built by Atlas Aircraft Corporation, over 60 of them, and they were also, others were supplied to the Rhodesian Air Force, which was also, of course, very strictly on the nose as well. But how they got there, somebody else will have to help us with that. There was a variant of this aeroplane, and this is called Bosbok, which means bushbuck, and they were called AM3Cs, and they equipped 2 squadrons, 41 and 42 Squadron, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. And I was with one of those squadrons at the Army main training base headquarters at Potchefstroom, which is west of Johannesburg. So the Bosbok was used for forward air control, as you can imagine. It was also used as a radio relay. They called it Telstar duty, and the target marketing. It had rockets under wing which generated smoke, probably for the artillery and people like that to be able to target, and Casevac and other general duties. Anybody seen or know of the Albatros P166 DL? Yeah. Well, I had a flight instructor. Fortunately, it wasn't me. He was quite a way up guy, but I was around them at the time, and he said that when you actually firewalled the throttles on this aeroplane, the only thing that changed was the look on the pilot's face. So now, whether he had a particular dislike for the plane or it really was that underpowered, I don't know. But anyway, it was called, first started off as a kind of executive little plane called the Portofino, and it got a new fuselage and tail, and eventually it could take up to 10 seats. So because the Shackletons, which I'll tell you about later, had their own problems, they probably used these more for inshore coastal patrol type work. And 20 were originally supplied, and they were used by number 27 Squadron South African Air Force. The Alouette 2, there was the Alouette 2 and Alouette 3, but the Alouette 2 was apparently the first mass-produced turbine-powered helicopter in the world, and it was very, very well thought of. It had outstanding performance. So South African Air Force only had a total of 8, I suppose initially for training to teach people to fly helicopters, but it went on, and it was widely used not by the South African Air Force but by the Rhodesian Air Force during their war there. Here you have the Alouette 3, people more familiar with the Alouette 3. This was also a very popular aircraft. There were 121 acquired between 1962 and 1975. By 1966 they had a total of 50, and they dispatched several of this type to support the army, which was of course stationed in Southwest Africa fighting the SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organisation, and that became the start of the lengthy Bush War. Throughout the course of its service, the South African Air Force, believe it or not, accumulated 346,000 flight hours. And the last Alouette was drawn from service, 3 was drawn from service in 2006. And I studied work practices at the Air Depot near Pretoria, and I was also asked when my job ran out there to make working drawings of the air intake filters for the helicopter, to say for local manufacture. This is very interesting, by the way. If you ever visit South Africa, this is at the War Memorial in Johannesburg. Another museum well worth going to is the Air Force Museum, which is outside Pretoria. And Buccaneer was South Africa was the only other country to operate the Buccaneer. And this version had the big Spey engine in. It was called the S2 version. And South Africa originally had 16. Somehow they lost one on the way, and the crew had to actually eject somewhere over mid-Atlantic. But by some great fluke, they found these people. Why the plane was lost, I don't know. It's at the bottom of the sea. Anyway, this was part of the so-called Simonstown Agreement, where the United Kingdom obtained use of this particular naval base in exchange for South Africa acquiring weapons. And there was an order for a further 20 Buccaneers, and this was blocked by the British Prime Minister as well. And I visited this particular squadron as well and made some studies there. There's a bit of a, not an aeroplane unfortunately, but this is something called Cactus or Cretal was the French name. And in July 1964, South Africa placed an absolute blanket order with the French company Thomson, Houston, later called Thomson CSF, to develop and supply a all-weather, low-altitude, surface-to-air guided missile system, together with all the all-terrain vehicles that accompanied it. So they had a whole lot of vehicles in one composite thing. They called it a platoon for some reason. I don't know why, but they called it a platoon. It was only for exact target defense. And Thomson was the prime contractor, and the Matra company, which is the French missile company, they made the missile. That's the missile sitting over there. And this is the actual launcher vehicle. And what they've done on the left-hand side, they've actually cut the two launcher pods away, and so you could actually see into them. And interestingly enough, when this thing was fired, it left its launcher at Mach 2 with its rocket motor already burnt out. So after that it was just coasting to its target. And they had 7 platoons of these altogether. This aeroplane I think we're probably a lot more familiar with. There's 2 versions of the Canberra, and the one was the Mark 12 and this one was the T4, the lower one. And I also visited that squadron. While I was with that squadron, just at the end of the time, things were changing, because these aircraft, probably the top one, that would be the top one, they were using the aeroplanes for high altitude photographic reconnaissance of enemy positions. I also thought they were a bit clever in that they would note which flight paths conventional aircraft took, civil aircraft, and then they would fly these along the same route, so that people would see the plane with contrail up there and say, oh, well, it's just another airline. It was so high. Meanwhile, they're just taking photographs of them for later use. And these particular Model 12 at the top, they were the very last ones built by English Electric. And in the bomb bay, they could carry 4x20mm Hispano cannon or a rocket pack. And what were the reasons that Britain decided to sell these to South Africa? I don't know. Somebody else will have to research that. Then South Africa had the Cessna 185As. I was actually with one of these 2 squadrons, and they were used for artillery spotting, army liaison and that sort of thing. Then the only thing that's a bit awkward to understand is I understood they always belonged to the Air Force, and you can see on the side of the plane it says SA Lear, which means South African Army, and the shield badge, if you could see it, it seems to be a corrupted version of the 42 Squadron heraldry. Why that was, I don't know. Well, you can't go through a talk without talking about the great plane of all times, can you? So I'm not going to bother you with too many particulars on the Dakota. There were 84 taken on charge by the South African Air Force during World War II. And then when there was a need for more of them, 8 C-47s were returned by South African Airways to the Air Force. Sorry, were sold by 2 South African Airways, and 6 eventually came back, plus an ordinary DC-3. And this aeroplane is a Harvard. Fortunately, the Royal Australian Air Force never flew the Harvard. It seems every other Air Force did. But anyway, they were supplied under what they call the Joint Air Training Scheme, which must be virtually the same thing as the Empire Air Training Scheme here. And they were Mark 1s, Mark 2s and Mark 3s, so they were obviously British procurements. And some of the early ones had a bit of wood in the fuselage at the rear as well. And well, they got a huge number of them. They got 633 of these altogether. And then this was followed by the 86, together with some of the American naval versions, which were called the SNJs, SNJ-4. And they eventually fitted another machine gun had one machine gun, they fitted another machine gun, and they could also carry unguided rockets under wing. And the Hercules had an outstanding career with the South African Air Force from 1963 even to the present day. And I was at that squadron, number 28 squadron, and one was seriously damaged a while ago, and I know we're talking past 1980 now, but I understand they only have 2 of them left. And they were able to maintain all of these, 7 of them, right from 1963 right till well after, to maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It's pretty sad. And from the early 1970s, Lockheed was forced to stop selling anymore to South Africa. However, Lockheed has produced several versions of the Hercules called L100. And a South African civilian airline, in brackets civilian, it was called Safair, was quickly set up and rapidly became the world's largest operator of the L100. At one time they had 17 of them altogether. And needless to say, much of the business, serious business, came from the South African Air Force, and its history is still to be written. As a matter of fact, he's not here today, but we've got one of our members who actually was a pilot with Safair, but I haven't seen him here today. And these aircraft, this is another thing, we South Africans call them Impala. This was the Mackie 326. So there were 2 versions of the Impala. This was the first aircraft to actually be made by the Atlas Aircraft Corporation. And the one on the left, which is called the Impala 1, is a trainer, but it also was used in offensive, in air attack operations. The one on the right is a single-seater, and this is the K version, which was manufactured in South Africa. I'm not sure whether the design of the K with variations came through the Brazilian company, which is called Embraer, or from Mackie itself. A lot of them were made in South Africa, and 100 altogether. And the South African Air Force, as an aside, speaking to an army man one day, they weren't very happy about the air support they got from the South African Air Force during this very difficult time. They felt they weren't there when they should be there. This is the Mirage 3, of course, which is more familiar to us in Australia. These Mirages all came from the Dassault factory. That the ones on the left, actually, there were 2 models of this basic fighter or ground attack. The one on the left is called a CZ. Z in Dassault always stood for South Africa. They always used a single letter to designate the countries. But that one is a CZ, which were originally supplied, and the one on the right is called an EZ. And that was more a ground attack version with the proper electronics for that. If you look at the 2 aeroplanes very carefully, the one on the left has got what's called an eyelid type jet nozzle, adjustable jet nozzle, and the one on the right has got a petal type jet nozzle. And the picture on the right, on the extreme right, that shows what's called an RZ, 3RZ, and this is a reconnaissance version. So what they've done is they've taken the interception radar out of that thing and they put cameras and things in that, and we'll talk about that very presently. Now, believe it or not, the Mirage, when it didn't have external fuel tanks on, it only had a combat radius of 180 miles. So, you know, at jet speed, you can imagine it's not very long at all. And a pilot who flew these, I met him here at our museum that I go to. He said that when this aircraft was completely fully loaded or overloaded, it's going to depart control quite quickly. He said you have to be very careful with the plane, it was very heavy. And I didn't study the aeroplanes at the number 2 squadron, who were the only ones using it at the time. And their maintenance people got very suspicious when our little group of people walked into their hangar and where they were, and they really were worried, and they somehow wangled that nobody was going to study what they did from the maintenance point of view, or maybe not do from the maintenance point of view, and we were virtually out of the place the same day, so there was no report submitted on the Mirages. And South Africa was among the earliest customers for the Mirage 3. They ordered 15 originally. I won't go through all the orders, but they had various missiles as well, and guided missiles, and they also had two-seaters. But over here, a couple of things you see on the top right hand, apparently they got the idea from the Israelis, but this was like to keep a pilot in readiness strapped into the aeroplane. So what you had there, you had a sun shield which went over the canopy, and then the vehicle on the right hand side, that would have the pneumatic power and the air power to start this thing, quick smart. And this was not used by the South Africans to any extent. Maybe it only came with original ones. They had a small rocket engine which delivered 3,000 pounds of thrust only for 1 minute. And on most Mirages, that cavity taken up by this engine, this is the exhaust nozzle over here, by the way, and that's the fuel tank over there. The cavity is normally used for another fuel tank. And we'll talk later about Mirage F1, but the original Mirage 3s, they were finally dedicated to secondary roles in the conflict. And the reason for this, that the Serrano radar, which was the radar in the nose, almost made night flying and bad weather flying impossible. And also with its very high nose attitude, it was very difficult to land on rudimentary strips near to the operational areas. You couldn't see where you're going, and the strips were quite crude. Anyway, it was in Mirage 3's RZ, which is a reconnaissance one, that kept on being used all the time, because South Africa had only one aircraft for photo reconnaissance other than that, and that was the Canberra. And just one more. Here's the rocket engine, just something about its power. It took 9 minutes to 70,000 feet on mixed power, and with jet power alone, you could kind of climb the thing, and you could also get to 71,000 feet. A surface ceiling, you've got another 100 feet with it, and its maximum Mach number, if we could achieve Mach 2.2 at 60,000, and Mach 2.4 if you still had the rocket going. And during reconnaissance missions, the RZs would often fly, that's the reconnaissance, would fly at extremely low altitudes, sometimes as low as 50 feet. Just before reaching their targets, the aircraft would enter a rapid climb for photographs and then turn away. And the idea was to also get a response from the Cuban or Angolan pilots, because they would only try and engage with the South African aircraft over their territory, where they had this extremely dangerous ground SAMs. So they weren't too keen to engage otherwise. Interesting enough, the Dassault company has also carried on with normal Delta aircraft, as you might be aware of, with the Mirage 2000 and then the Mirage Rafale. So it's hard to say, what are the advantages of one over the other, because they've continued with both configurations. But this is just a whole list of the kind of embargoes that were being put on South Africa at the time, and the one that seems to be the most restrictive and something had to be done about was in 1977, which was a resolution which was originally put from the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1963, but then it became a Security Council resolution in 1977. And this is where things became extremely difficult for the importation of arms into South Africa. Now the F1 Mirage itself, and it was also employed with the French Army de Air, might have been employed with other operators as well initially. There were also two-seat versions of the F1, but the South African Air Force didn't go for the two-seat versions. Presumably, if you could fly a Mirage 3, you wouldn't have any problems in flying a Mirage 1. The South African armaments industry was even interested in actually manufacturing the F1 in South Africa, but the French, I think, got cold feet on this by this stage. Not only were they supplying equipment to South Africa, but allowing South Africa to make their designs, I think, was one step too far. So initially there were 16 of these employed. Now they were called CZ, and with the docile designation, the C always stood for an interceptor, and the A stood for aircraft more dedicated to the ground attack role. And the Z, of course, was a national thing, which Z stood for South Africa. So these were delivered with a further 32 AZs, and the first of the deliveries occurred in 1975. And both of these particular variants of aircraft were used extensively in the border war after 1978, and they were to provide reconnaissance support to a reconnaissance aircraft, possibly Canberra's, I believe, but there was also Mirage 3 RZ, so they provided cover for them. And also the ones in the ground attack role, they were fitted with these rocket pods called a Matra M155, which was unguided rockets, as well as 250 kilogram bombs. And now they mixed it with the Angolan MiG-21s on occasions, and 2 of them were shot down by South African pilots. The same pilot, coincidentally, a year later, did both kills using machine guns. The air-to-air missiles that the South Africans had didn't seem to be too reliable, and maybe that was the lesson they should have learned from Vietnam as well. That's, what did the Americans say, American pilots, about nothing is better than a gun, and that's proved it there. And others of them were damaged, and one was actually captured by the South Africans, where this pilot didn't seem to know his compass coordinates very well, and instead of flying north to go back home, he decided to fly south and land at the South African base. And that aircraft is in the South African Museum, by the way, if you want to have a look at it. And there were 3 F1s lost in this encounter, and one was quite an unhappy story, where this one pilot had been in combat against these other aircraft, and aircraft was damaged, and he returned to base, and he thought that would be the end of it. But as the aircraft just touched the ground on landing, the ejection seat automatically operated, and he wasn't ready for that, and he unfortunately didn't get out of it very well. Still alive today. This aircraft is the same as the Mirage 3. It's capable of a Mach 2.2. And this is a Puma helicopter. I think most of you have seen a Puma at some time or another, or familiar with them. And they were prolifically used by the South African Air Force. The South African Air Force also made lots of modifications to these local modifications. And because they couldn't get future Pumas, they decided to buy as much spares and aircraft as they could. And the last ones were delivered in 1977. Is just a list, and this is 1989's list, so it's outside the scope of what I'm talking about, but it gives a very good idea of the various aircraft types that were in service in that period, 1960 to 1980 as well. And I've got a brochure or a document. If any of you want that kind of information, it's in the document, together with lots of other stuff, which I can't talk about today. This is the Sabre, and this particular Sabre is called the Canadair Sabre 6, which of course was fitted with an Avro Orenda engine. There were originally 34 of these supplied, only one actual order of 34, and they were used right up to 1980 altogether. and many South African pilots flew this particular aircraft. The aircraft must not be confused with the F-86F Sabre. These Sabres were supplied to the South African Air Force in Korea, and they flew for, I think, just over a year or 18 months in Korea. It's not the same aircraft, and these aircraft were handed back to the USAF, the F-86F Sabres. So it's a different model Sabre. And interesting enough, South Africa was the second country in the world to fly the Sabre after the United States Air Force. This is another view of Sabres here. What's quite interesting with this picture on the right, you can see some of the new boys in the back. There's the Mirages over there in the background, and we'll talk about it briefly later, but there's also a Vampire trainer here, right in the front, having some work done on its instrumentation. The Shackleton itself is an interesting aircraft, and they were delivered in 1957, and as it so happened, maybe that's where my first interest in aviation was really on steroids by that time, because the school I went to was in line with the main runway at the Victoria base. So I actually saw the first Shackleton come in. I also saw the Shackleton, the Sabre on the first day of flight as well. But these particular aircraft were, I'm trying to find the number here. Anyway, by 1958, all 8 had been delivered, and they were operated by 35 Squadron, which of course obviously maritime, reconnaissance squadron. And it was the same as the Mark III Shackleton. To distinguish between the marks, the Mark 1 and 2 had tail wheels, and the Mark III had a bicycle undercarriage. And again, this sanctions problem was really getting to South Africa. They couldn't get parts for them, and eventually they ran out of fatigue life, and they were going to respar them, and they only resparred 2, one in the UK and one back in South Africa. And they were so desperately short of parts, years before 1963 or 1964, one of them had crashed in the mountains near Cape Town, and the maintenance people went to that wreck and scavenged what they could off the wreck to get some useful parts. But it all came to an end, and we were only 2 over operationally when they withdrawn from service. This is the C-54 and the DC-4. By the way, the purists, the only Skymaster that's a Skymaster was actually the C-54. The rest are all called DC-4s. And I worked on these aircraft at South African Airways, and 5 were transferred to the South African Air Force. And by that time, these aeroplanes were old. They had already been flying since 1946. So you can imagine what condition they were in. The next one, some people in the room will be interested in this particular aircraft, because these were the Vampires, and they were the first jets that were used in the South African Air Force. They first obtained 10 single-seat Vampires in 1950, and I'm speaking under correction now, but I believe that those aircraft did not have ejection seats.
That's right. That's right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they were followed by 30 fighter bomber FB-53s in 1952, a further batch of 30 FB-9s in 1953, and these single-seaters remained in service until 1967. That's a single-seater there, the lower one, of course. And then there were more delivered, 6 early spec T-55s, and another 21 T-55s in 1954 and 1955, and there were finally 2 more T-55s in 1981. And now somebody else in this room is better to talked about this than me. Maybe this person's already given a talk and I wasn't here or wasn't paying attention. Hope not. But a lot of these were supplied to the Rhodesian Air Force. And there's a whole story here about, there were many of them. They They got FB4s, 13 FB9s, 19 T55s, and of these, 4 FB52s and 13 FB9s apparently were in service into the 80s. And as an aside, I had a ride on one of these T55s, and when we'd finished this practice air-to-air interception with a Sabre, we landed on the runway, and the Sabre that we had intercepted did a very, very low beta right over our plane. So much so that if you had helmets and earphones and everything on it, was actually thunder going over you. I don't know how much the aeroplane missed us by. That's the Super Frelon. Frelon, by the way, means hornet in French, and it had 3 engines. It was produced by Sud Aviation, which later became Aerospatiale. It held the distinction of being the most powerful helicopter to be built in Europe at the time, as well as being the world's fastest helicopter. So the South African Air Force had 16 of these delivered after May 1966, and there were more delivered in 1969, and they were used in the border war with whatever you're going to use a heavy lift helicopter for. You're all familiar with the Transall? Right, I don't think ever any Transalls in Australia, were there? No. Well, the Transall is actually an abbreviation, and it means Transporter Alliance, and it was built by 3 European companies. I won't go into that with you. And they were also sold to Turkey, apparently into Germany, France, and then Turkey. And they were all scrapped in the end, and only one survives, and that's the South African Air Force Museum. If I can put a plug in for the South African Air Force Museum, you can see a lot of it on the internet anyway, but they've got some very interesting aircraft there, and this is one of them. This Westland Wasp, this is an anti-submarine helicopter, and with the arrangements they had to protect the Cape of Good Hope, as some people saw it, these aircraft were operated off ships of the South African Navy. This was in 1964, and I was actually at this Acerplaat Air Station in 1968, not in 1966, and that I did mention in my the little group that we were in doing these inspections at these various Air Force squadrons. That was my lieutenant, the man with the glasses there on the right. As a matter of fact, I still keep in touch with him today. There were initially 10 delivered, and a further batch of 8 were ordered, but only 6 of the batch were delivered, and then the British government decided to enforce that part of the arms embargo, so they missed out on 2 of them. Very briefly, these aircraft, which was also flown by South African Air Force, a Viscount, a Series 700 Viscount, Mercurius, which was a fancy name for the HS-125, Hawker City 125, the Merlin we know about here in WA, Schwerigen Merlin, and then finally I had a de Havilland Heron to provide you with that. So thank you very much. Good speaking to you again.